Hi, everyone. I'm Praycious Wilson Gay, and I'm a part of the Shakespeare in Prison Network's Planning Committee. We have been hosting a series of conversations that we got in response to a survey that we issued to the network. And we're hoping to engage in meaningful conversations. And I'm very, 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 very excited about presenting today's panel. Today, we'll be having a conversation around radical self-care with our lovely panelists who will now introduce themselves. We're going to start with Mama Nia from SpiritHouse Inc.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Nia Wilson, and I am the co-director of an organization based out of Durham, North Carolina. Our name is SpiritHouse Incorporated. SpiritHouse is a cultural arts and organizing tribe, Black woman-led organizing tribe that began in 1999, so we just turned 20 years old. And we work in communities, primarily African-American communities, to amplify the voices and the needs of the communities that are most directly impacted by racism and all of its systemic oppressive systems. I'm really, really excited to be able to be here with you all and talk about what kinds of self-care are important for working for ourselves and also for working within our communities.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stephan Wolford, one of the founders of the DE-CRUIT program. This is Dawn Stern, Chief Operating Officer of DE-CRUIT, as well as I'm her spouse. DE-CRUIT is a program that uses Shakespeare to treat trauma, is the short version of it. It's been in development for over 25 years, and over the last about 7 or 8 years has been scientifically evaluated as well. It originated with military veterans. It was a program that I created leaving the military. I was in the military, used Shakespeare and classical actor training to help heal my trauma, recover from addiction and trauma and all of its effects from childhood as well as military service. But the original plan, even though it's called DE-CRUIT, because the idea of we're recruited but never decruited out of the military, it's always been that it should be expanded to anyone who can use it and be informed by the people who are coming into the program. So we've expanded now. We're more than just DE-CRUIT for veterans. We're DE-CRUIT for any population that wants to use any of the principles that we found that have been scientifically proven to work, as well as the ancient practices, bring them all together and modify them as an ever-growing, ever-living event, just like theater is. Dawn will talk more later.
I just wanted to add that our model was generously given to us by Randy Reinholtz of Native Voices in Los Angeles and Yvette Nolan of Native Earth. We worked with those companies for a decade before we even formed what we're doing, and that really informed our practices. And as well as the trauma, both racialized and other, that I received, and realizing that this application and that PTSD wasn't just exclusively, obviously, for veterans. So then I began right away working with family members of veterans. And so we had this veteran civilian coalition, and that's really how the work started expanding. And now we are doing DE-CRUIT RX for first responders, DE-CRUIT BIPOC, led by an African-American veteran in New York City, who's our class coordinator for the organization. DE-CRUIT Women Only in Chicago, led by a woman there who's worked with us for 5 to 7 years now. So it's rapidly expanding because we're seeing that these applications are much more than we originally thought.
Hello, everyone. My name is Suraya Keating, and I've been working in the California prison and jail system for 17 years. The past 15 years, I've worked with Marin Shakespeare Company's Shakespeare in Prison programs as their Shakespeare for Social Justice Director. And when I started with Marin Shakespeare in 2005, we were in one prison, San Quentin State Prison. And since then, we have grown and expanded and are now very proudly in 14 California prisons all over the state. Our program focuses on using both Shakespeare and life story theater to inspire growth, healing, and connection. And I'm also a registered drama therapist for many years. So I bring in drama therapy tools to the work that we do, as do some of our other instructors as well. Really good to be here with you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for giving those introductions. So some of you who may be watching may be thinking, what exactly is radical self-care? I think we can all understand what self-care is, but radical self-care just comes with a heightened commitment to yourself. So in the simplest form, radical self-care is providing and committing to the deepest form of nourishment that is for you. Whether it's setting a boundary to prevent stress-inviting events in your life, or if it's carving out time in a busy workday to exercise, that is committing to yourself to make sure that you are taking care of yourself and that those that you are working with are also taking care of themselves and really doing it not on the base level, but really making the time and commitment to take care and self-care for yourself. So as practitioners who work with marginalized, incarcerated, traumatized communities, I found it important that we host a conversation around that. I know personally, I am helping to launch a program at a correctional facility in New York City, and something that continued to come back to me as I was going through the trainings, as I was, experiencing the work, was that how are we taking care of those that are potentially unearthing their trauma, and then how are we taking care of those who are helping them unearth their trauma? Because hard sessions that are trauma filled, there has to be self-care on both sides. And I believe in doing this work, there has to be radical self-care on both sides. So with that in mind, I would love to pose a question and a few questions to the panelists. And I would like to start by asking Suraya a question about how do you define and or exemplify radical self-care in your practices?
Thank you, Precious. Well, I love your definition of radical self-care and very much resonate with the need for us to really honor this blessed body that we're given. And there can be so many forces from the outside pressuring us to not listen to our bodies, not listen to our hearts, not listen to our spirit. So for me, radical self-care starts with a kind of deep listening to what my body needs, what my heart needs, and what my spirit needs. Yeah, that's my succinct definition. I can just share a little more personally. Back in February, I had to go through open heart surgery for a life-threatening heart condition that I was born with. And some of you might have experienced those kind of events in your life, which just kind of stop everything and force you to listen in a big way. And for me, that was a great opportunity to slow down and listen to really, what do I need aside from the pressures of work or what others expect of me? So yeah, taking that kind of listening into the everyday for me is radical self-care.
Anyone can feel free to jump in. Yeah.
I will say that this concept is probably the one that we work with the most, and we start with the most with the participants who come into DE-CRUIT. The people who self-select for our program have oftentimes exhausted everything else, everything the VA has given them, everything that they know. And that's why they're ready to try on some crazy, kooky actor, classical training stuff that they don't know anything about, think that has nothing to do with them. So they're desperate. And one of the first things that we talk about with the participants when we introduce this concept, and we even saying radical self-care, we get pushback because right away they're like, I'm a mother, I'm a woman veteran, I have military sexual trauma, I have 2 kids and a husband, and everyone tells me self-care, but what does that mean? How do I do that? So what we realized very quickly is we actually had to break it down in pieces that they could comprehend, that didn't feel like it was one more task that they were failing at. So we really introduced the concept, in ways that we know that they're going to get. Like when you're on an airplane and they say, hey, put on your mask before you put on your child's mask, right? Or in life-saving, they say the rule is in the military, if you've ever done swimming, life-saving, the first rule is do not create a second victim. If you're risking your life going in to save someone, now someone's got to save two people instead of one. Do not create a second victim. And that really speaks to veterans. So we really had to listen to veterans before we're throwing out these comments. We really listened to what they were saying and then learn to break it down. And I really would like to piggyback on what was just said in that it all for us begins with teaching the participants to observe themselves without judgment, without what I used to call the shitty committee, right? All these voices that tell you what you can and cannot do and should and shouldn't be doing. And that is so much of the work, because so many times the people who come into our rooms are running so hard from something or to something that they have not developed any kind of skill of listening to their body, which is, as anyone practitioner, the beginning of radical self-care. And then I don't know if you have anything.
I'll just, so that I don't take up too much time, the mere fact that we're treating trauma with Shakespeare is radical. I was patient 0 and noticed that this was working better than anything else. Therapy, our dropout rate for veterans is 65% within the first 90 days. So traditional is not working. We know this because the numbers of suicides are going up. Look at any of the trends for anything happening right now, and it's all going in the wrong direction. So we need radical. Whatever it means to each individual, fine, go with that. But ours starts in the breath, which is all the ancient practices. It's not something new. Classical actor training isn't new. It's borrowing from Qigong. It's borrowing from the native traditions, indigenous traditions. It's borrowing from everything that's existed in our existence since the beginning. So radical is really going back and using what works that doesn't need to be scientifically evaluated, but we're evaluating it. I'll defer the rest of my time.
Yeah, so I would like to take a moment for us to experience some radical self-care. And I would like to encourage everyone who is watching this to take a moment to place your one hand on your belly and one hand on your chest and to take an actual deep breath, to actually breathe deeply, to feel life flowing through your body now. Feel life flowing through your veins. To take a moment to think about why you are here. To understand that your purpose is much larger than the job you do, than the struggles you may be facing, than anything else that you're dealing with in this moment. That is radical. And we should be able to live in that moment at all times. And so, what I want to say about radical self-care is that it begins with understanding, knowing, understanding, and working within your purpose at all times. So the work that we do is difficult. The communities that we work in are communities that are struggling every day to just survive. And the ability to walk in your purpose in those moments is difficult. The world does not teach us that we have that ability, right? We're constantly being forced to do, to produce, to perform. Our lives have not been our own. We have not been taught that our lives matter. And so we should be in the practice of self-care at all times. And that is not an easy practice to learn, but it is something that I want to make sure that we continue to talk about and that we expand on. So for people who do this kind of work, a lot of times we get in it, you know, we are working hard to prepare, we're taking into consideration everyone who's going to be in the room, what we want to provide for them, what we want to open up for them, and it's for them, for them, for them, for them. And we're not necessarily understanding that we are trying to provide that for ourselves, that's why we're here. We're here to create and open a space of healing, of love, of breath, not only for the other, not only for someone else, but for ourselves. And if we're not practicing that in our everyday work, in our everyday movements, then we have to actually take a step back and rethink that. Why are you here? If you came here to create that kind of space, if you came here to help to heal the traumas that the world is experiencing, that you are also experiencing, it is different, but we're all born into a traumatic system. And so if you came here to help heal that, then your own self-care is important from start to finish, from the time you open up your eyes in the morning to the time you close your eyes, as a form of radical self-care at night, making sure that you get adequate rest and drink water and all of those things that we can share and talk about. And so, you know, as we continue the conversation, I hope that everyone continues to breathe through this moment and remember that life is flowing through your body right now, and that in and of itself is a healing practice. And it is the easiest practice that you can teach to others, that you can open up for others.
Yes, to all of that. And thank you for that moment to just breathe. As I was listening to you talk, I realized after we took the moment to breathe, I stopped focusing on my breath. And then when you said, and then breathe, I was like, oh, breath, right? And so I appreciate that. And I also think that is a wonderful way to kind of lean into the next question, with what self-care practices and resources do you suggest for those that are working with over-policed, incarcerated, marginalized, traumatized communities? Because, you know, you are going into a situation that may not be one of your experience. I don't think that that is to say of anyone on this panel, but there are some practitioners who go into space and do not know necessarily how to take care of themselves afterward. And so what, along with the things that you've already mentioned, what practices or resources do you suggest for those that are doing the work in these communities? And I will ask for Stephan and Dawn to start.
Hey, wow. I am actually educating myself. So I feel more like a participant here than a practitioner. I think one of the things that's, I'm going to say it, but it's one of the hardest, I think it's one of the hardest things, and even though it seems like it wouldn't be, but I really feel like that this trauma, and have been reading and attending workshops, but that the trauma it's happening to us individually, and it's happening to us communally or culturally. And so therefore, one of the first things, also because our populations are dealing with a high suicide rate, because I think is the recognition of that, just feeling so alone and feeling so isolated. So one of the first self-care practices that I would ever recommend is connecting that person specifically with a group, with a community that is aware that this is happening, because so many are dealing with gaslighting and negating. So first of all, connecting that person with the community so they're not standing on their own so that they really understand that whatever their individual experience is, there's a community that is dealing with this, and that it is happening, and that it has happened generationally. So that is a lot. So that the recognition that the feelings and everything that we're carrying isn't even all ours. It is, and then it's plus. So I really think for a long time, I felt so isolated and alone, and that nobody shared my unique experience. And so therefore I had to solve the problem on my own, which wasn't helpful and led me to a really dark place. So for me, I'm going to connect a person I know who's dealing with over-policing with a group immediately that knows about that. Does that make sense? And resources. I mean, we're developing. We have always had a reading list, but now we're also developing specific reading lists for each of the groups that I mentioned in the check-in. Yeah.
The one thing I'd just like to add, besides, I'll talk more later, I think, but to not forget that to survive trauma requires creativity. This is covered over and over again with massive amounts of research. So if we need science to prove it, it's been proven. And therefore, creativity can be a resource to recover from trauma as well. I mean, I'm not so dull as to think, oh, do Shakespeare and it'll help with policing in America. I'm, not an idiot. Well, some people might think, but what I'm talking about is how to recover from it afterwards, how to take care of ourselves, because we know Gabor Mate's book, When the Body Says No, he just tracks flat out chronic diseases and their links to trauma, whether it's childhood trauma or adult trauma. So we know this is creating chronic conditions. And so how can we bring ourselves back into regulation after is one of the resources we additionally add. But creativity is a key there.
So I'm wearing a rose quartz that I'm actually holding as I'm speaking. And I think one of the things that I would say is that resources that we want to provide for folks who are experiencing trauma, folks who feel over-policed, have to be really simple, something that you basically are able to keep in your pocket, whether it's literal or whether it's a practice that you can keep in your front pocket, right by your heart, that you can grab in a moment's notice. I'm going to tell you a little story. We work with a lot of people who are formerly incarcerated, a lot of young Black men who are formerly incarcerated, and we take them through different projects and programs. And at the end of one of our trainings, our harm-free zone training, we give everybody a crystal, or gave crystal bracelets sometimes, and sometimes we gave crystal necklaces, but we give everybody crystals. And we don't go into the whole theories that we understand about what crystals are, what they mean, what this and what that. For a lot of them, we just say, hold on to this rock when you are in your feeling the most trauma, and just let that energy go into this. And so one of the young men who, who we worked with, who is no longer with us, he was doing some things, he was involved in some things that he shouldn't have been involved in. And when we got him back to a place where we were able to bring him to us and sit him down and say, what's going on? What's going on? Why is this happening? What can we do? He said, I lost my rock. He said, Mama Nia, I lost my rock. I need another rock. And so we have to provide anchors that people that are realistic. We have had certain privileges, and I'm not saying that we are all privileged people, but probably everyone listening to this to this video has had certain privileges where you've gotten a certain understanding around healing tools and the theories behind them and why. And we don't have to provide that to everyone who was in the moment in their trauma. That is not the moment. But the moment is to make sure that they have something that makes sense to them that they can anchor to. And so, you know, for us, we give crystals and we give breathing practices, easy breathing practices. You know, I heard you bring that up also. Practices around rubbing yourself down, like because it's embodied. The trauma is not about what's happening in this particular moment. We have embodied trauma generationally. We're born, some of us, with that. And so how we're able to connect back into our bodies, because also when trauma happens, we leave our bodies, our spirits leave our bodies in search for safety. And so the things that help bring us back, that help ground us, and this is again for everyone. I understand that the question is about the communities that we're working with, but many of us are all. And so what are the grounding practices that are easy for the people that you're working with to retain, to hold on to grab, and to implement right away?
Yeah, I'm just gonna jump in here because I am hearing a lot of conversation about those who were previously incarcerated or have previously gone through trauma that has brought them to this point. But I am really, really interested in hearing from Suraya around what those practices are for those that are currently incarcerated when you can't necessarily pass them a crystal. It's in the same vein of, you know, breath and things of that nature, but what are some other things that can be offered for those who don't necessarily have that freedom?
Yeah, thanks, Precious. Well, I absolutely resonate with what Mama Nia was just sharing about really offering simple tools and inviting the group. There's such wisdom in the groups and resources in the groups I work with that finding out what they do that helps them. But just to piggyback on what I think Dawn was saying earlier around connection, for me, one of the biggest things we need to focus on is nourishing connection. You know, relational cultural theory says that there's only one disease in the world, and that's the disease of disconnection. So I'm always in the back of my consciousness thinking about, okay, how can I cultivate some connection here in a healthy way, a healthy connection with myself and the people I'm working with so they have a healthy connection with themselves? How can I cultivate a healthy connection even in the system? You know, every person I meet, every officer, every single staff, I treat with reverence and with a quality of the kind of connection I want to have and I want to bring forth. So that that concept of connection for me is really key. And I have certain favorite practices of my own that might resonate with some people and might not. So I'm a big advocate of working with the breath and working with intention setting. You know, Michael Beckwith, the amazing spiritual leader of Agape in Los Angeles, you know, he says there's only one, not one disease, sorry. There's a problem that we have intention deficit disorder, not attention, but intention. So just bringing back simple things like setting an intention. And I can just very briefly lead you through a simple breath practice that I love that gets us connected to our intention, which is just to, when I wake up in the morning, and I might offer this to a group, if it resonates, I think about what are two things, two qualities, essence qualities I want to bring to my day and to every interaction, whether I'm working in prison or with people who are formerly incarcerated or grocery store, wherever. And so I might think like, oh, today I really want to bring in faith and kindness. So I invite you all to just feel out two qualities that you want to bring to your life today, starting right now with this breath. And then as you breathe in that first quality. So I'm breathing in faith. When I breathe out kindness. And then I might repeat that several times or as long as I need to feel anchored in that it is alive in me. I'm giving my attention to the intention rather than to the million things that might be trying to pull me away or pull me into reactivity. So yeah, so simple practices is very much what I'm a fan of as well, and really using the group. I guess the last thing I'll say is one of the beautiful continual experience I have facilitating groups in prison and outside is just watching the way people inspire and support each other and learn. And it is so beyond anything I can offer. It's like the group takes over and has a life and an intelligence and a love of its own that then when that love is there in the group, it then brings out those resources from our cultural backgrounds, from spirit, from wherever, our grandmothers. And that is something I just try to cultivate the space so that can happen. I hope that makes sense.
Can I add to that, Precious? Because I really appreciate what you were saying, Suraya, and I think that one of the things that we really need to remember always as we're going into working communities is that we already have everything that we need to do what needs to be done. Part of our job is to help create the space for it to come to the surface. But when we begin to think that we are providing something, that we're bringing something, what we bring are the tools to create the space for what needs to happen. We are not bringing the solutions, and we can never walk into any of these spaces with the assumption that the people in the room don't already have, we're not born with brilliance. Did not come here with intention. And we forget that sometimes as practitioners, we forget that. And that is one of the things that will help us to actually transform. One of, people sometimes say, well, what happens if if everything gets fixed? And I'm like, so then I can go make art. Like because what we want to do is for people to be able to find the tools, pick the tools up and continue to move it. It should not always, the one thing each one of us is going to do is leave this earth. So it can't just rest within us. And so being able to excavate the brilliance that already exists, I really appreciate hearing you say that. And why I wanted to amplify it a little bit more is because being able to excavate the brilliance that already exists is what we should be doing.
I love that so much. I'm astounded sometimes when I get into rooms with professionals that and scientists and people with a lot of letters after their names, and not one of them have ever asked the population they're serving any of the questions about what they need. They just never ask them, and they already know. They so know. And the other thing is one of the things that working with Shakespeare or any text, the veteran that's creating the BIPOC said, well, there's other authors and texts that are going to speak to me and the group that I'm working with. And so he's going to be using other authors. But the thing about using the language that is not familiar with you, that is a foreign language, is that it can oftentimes trick trick the brain, right? Because all of their stuff gets activated with whatever they have around Shakespeare, with whatever that means, with whatever happens to them when they look at one sentence of Old English, right? So then their brain, and so then you get to see all of the activation. And then when we introduce the breath, a simple breath, what psychiatrists call box breathing, but there's many in yoga, there are many breaths, like carry that stone, something they have, you know, and a lot of times I feel like they just need permission. I mean, the veteran needs permission to go into a room to say no to everyone in the house and take 10 deep breaths, but they do. When they're working and we give them a simple direction, take one big breath, take one inhale in and speak one line of text, and then you see that where they're not doing that, you already see the issue with taking up time and space, that they are not even able to give themselves a breath. So the rest of the whole conversation and intellect that we have around trauma and all of that, it doesn't matter if they can't take a breath. It just doesn't. So I'm reiterating that tool. It's our number one tool, I think.
Yeah, I went to school to be a stage manager. And so one of the things that, you know, I had to take intro to acting classes and things like that. But, you know, one of the things that was constantly kind of pushed upon us was like, you're going to have to give actors the room to breathe. Like that's just for them to get into themselves, their character, they're going to have to breathe. And I truly was not introduced to, you know, breathing was always uncomfortable for me. Even taking a moment to ground myself, I felt uncomfortable because I'm like, these 15 minutes that I'm using to listen to this meditation, I could be doing something else, right? Like something that's causing me to be productive. I think, and I talked to the planning committee about this. I think that's something that I run into and what I'm learning my own self with radical self-care is setting actual boundaries and being like, I cannot show up to this meeting today because I am not well, because my people are dying and I'm watching them die. So I can't do it. Sorry. And that is so hard when I have been taught that it's all about production. You show up to the meeting, you package it up, you throw it away, you just do what you have to do to get through your day and deal with it later, right? Like it's so hard for me to be like, hard stop, no. I can't engage in this conversation with you. Not because I don't want to, but because I actually cannot. And using that breath, I find myself like in my room as I'm stuck in quarantine in Brooklyn, and you know, New York is kind of crazy right now, like breathing, and through the end of my breath, I either feel better or I've released or I've cried, or I'm like, now I can go into a conversation. Like there's so many things that that informs. And so like, I also want to reiterate for my own self that like radical self-care is setting firm boundaries, right? Like we live in a capitalistic world, and that capitalism forces product, and that product can keep you going all the time. So that when you do get to the point where you can take a step back and a moment for yourself, you feel guilty, right? You feel bad that you're taking a moment for yourself. But I think now more than ever, and even before, we have to take time for ourselves, especially when we're dealing with communities that definitely feel the pressure of not having that time, because when they walk outside to take a walk, they are afraid, right? They're not, the walks are not leisurely, they're not casual. I've had my own experience with that in New York City when the curfew thing was going down. Like I was scared to walk outside because I was like, what if I walk somewhere, turn the wrong corner, and somebody has some weird whatever they have on me, and then I'm being persecuted, right? So I also want to add in, like, creating safe space is also very radical and self-care. And whatever that safe space is for you, you have to do a deep exploration and have that deep nourishment with yourself. So I want to pivot the conversation just a tiny bit, because this is so great in terms of, how we are dealing with communities. But what I will say is that we are also going through a world pandemic. And I have talked to my therapist about my self-care is going out to the club and dancing. and releasing and, you know, hanging out with friends. And right now I can't do any of that. And it's also not in the foreseeable future for me. So how have the self-care practices with the communities that you're working with, and how have self-care practices as being a practitioner shifted due to the pandemic? And I invite anybody to begin.
Thank you for that, Precious. One of the things that I want to say that I want to add to that, and it also then fits in with what your question is that words like self-care and safety are most often seen and felt as luxury for Black people. And so even like using the word, you know, makes you sit back and be like, no, that we don't get that. We don't actually have the luxury of having that thing that you're talking about. That belongs to somebody else, because we were conditioned to believe that our purpose is to produce, as you said. So today, I actually turned the vacation mode on my emails, both personal and organizational, and said we are a Black women-led organization who is experiencing all the things that you just said, Precious, and that we need a moment. We need a moment, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for understanding. Being forced into this moment, though, folks that I know when the pandemic first started slept for like 2 weeks straight, didn't understand how it was that they couldn't wake up, didn't understand, and definitely felt guilty, and were really confused about the fact that our bodies just shut down. The pandemic is awful, so I don't want to give it any accolades. But I do believe that the universe is presenting us an opportunity to understand that how we have been moving has not served any of us. And the shift in order to make a difference for that is actually not easy. If you have been conditioned to believe that your body is here to produce, a forced stop doesn't necessarily is not necessarily a joyful moment. It's not necessarily a moment where you're like, "Ooh, vacation time." No, because you have been conditioned to be a particular way. So even in this moment, there are people who are trying so hard to continue moving in the same fashion. So now it's like, can't go to the office, so we just have a million Zoom calls, you know, and we spend all our time on Zoom. And even we spend all our time on Zoom looking for radical self-care practices. And so we radically self-care via Zoom all day long. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So breathing, drinking water, eating good food, doesn't have to be expensive, but it does have to be something that nourishes your body. And giving yourself the opportunity to rest. Watch some trashy movies. You know, you can balance it out. Read a really, you know, necessary, good book, and watch, you know, whatever, something trashy. I don't know. What do you watch now? Housewives, you know, something like that.
Whatever it is.
Yeah, you know, it's all right. It's no judgment. And stop judging yourself. Stop judging yourself for whatever it is that you need in this moment. You know, for weeks, I was so worried all day, every day. You know, the hand washing, you know, oh no, there's no toilet. Like, what happened? What is this thing around toilet paper, right? There's no toilet paper. What am I going to do next week when I only have three rolls left? What am I going to do when they run out? Like, that constant worry has been there, and it's just beginning to subside now several months into this. So, you know, listening to your body, saying, I can only work, you know, you got 2-3 hours of good production time for me for a day, and that's it. And then doing something else, or sleeping without guilt, trusting that the universe has given you permission to do something that you could not give yourself. And be in meditation, be prayerful, if that's one of the words that you use. Surrender to the universe. You see all the trees behind me. They are teaching me so many lessons about what it means to just be still and to go with the moment. You know, they've been here, many of them much longer than I have been. And so that's a good reminder for me. And so, you know, sort of decolonizing, you know, the mind, unlearning what not only my mind, but what my body has been conditioned to do, is what this moment is for me, which includes, as I said, eating good food, taking my vitamins, drinking a lot of water, so that I am giving this vessel that houses my spirit everything that it needs to continue to thrive, even in this moment.
Yeah, thank you, Mama Nia, for that. Thank you so much. You know, I respond to this question with a lot of humility, as a white woman who has benefited from white privilege, and that I can go outside and feel safe. And I very much realize that that is not how it is for Black and brown people. You know, as a woman, sometimes I don't feel safe, but being white, I do benefit from that privilege. And that's not okay. And that's something I'm very conscious of. Now that said, with the pandemic, one thing that I've been contemplating, and this is inspired by you, Mama Nia, too, is how can I create a kind of safe space here? Like, how can I really honor this temple of my body and my heart and my emotions? And that's been a continual practice throughout my life, is just making me a safe space for me, where I just really breathe into and do my darn best, still working on it, to love all those parts of myself. And more has been coming out with this intense world situation. You know, just seeing all the rumblings of very challenging feelings. So that's a big practice, really, me a safe space for me, that I then hope ripples out into, when I'm around others, being a safe space for them. And then the second thing I want to share is, yeah, not to minimize the suffering and the deaths from the pandemic, but I do feel like it's important in any situation to ask, what are the blessings and potential gifts here? And I've been doing that as well as a self-care practice, and as a deep inquiry of like, okay, what is the gift here? And one big one for me is to really stop the human doingness that we're so, I think, in this culture, just, you know, trained to be on the wheel and keep it going. Like you said, Precious, the productivity, and really learn to be a human being and be in communion with whatever is in front of me in the moment. You know, I'm a single mom. I've been spending 24/7 with my 9-year-old son. So just like, you know, finding that beauty in the relationship and how I can really create the most loving relationship with him. Not like it's all rainbows and unicorns, but just really trying. And with the plants around me and all the beings around me. So that's another big focus, is just like, okay, who's in front of me now, whether it's on Zoom or right here in my living space? And how can I bring some kind of gift forward to that connection.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see us nodding and applauding everything that's being said.
So good.
Both the beautiful and the difficult to take. We want to add to that is that I'll start here. Antonio Damasio wrote a book called Descartes' Error. He talks about how Descartes did us, all of humanity, a disservice by separating the mind from the body. And I feel like everything we've been doing has been trying to reconnect these two. And then COVID-19, aside from the pandemic, what has it done? It's turned us all into these talking heads once again. It for our population, for our work, it is highlighted everything that's absolutely in the way. It's highlighted everything that trauma does to the mind and body, and it has accented it. So we've had to try and figure out, well, what do we do in the room normally, and how do we do that with disembodied heads at a distance? We know that trauma makes us feel alone, as Dawn, it's been mentioned, makes us feel isolated. It robs us of our language. It takes us out of our time and place of being right here, right now. It puts us back in the past trauma or past environment. It robs us of our own self-worth and our body as it exists. So then COVID puts us in fear, so we're not breathing deeply. So it's robbing us of our breath. It puts us in isolation in our homes and alone, perhaps even in the environments that are re-traumatizing us, because we tend to replicate our childhood trauma environments if we don't deal with it. The military, quite brilliantly, there's been a ton of, I have a lot of problems with my military service in the military, but what they do is, we know this through data, is they take the vast majority of people join the military are coming from childhood environments that are traumatic. So taking traumatized children, putting them in an environment that seems attractive to those of us who have childhood environments that are traumatic, and gives us everything that we need that I just mentioned to replace it. Gives us a new self-worth, a new self-identity, puts us in a uniform so we're all part of a unit, gives us the community. It teaches us how to breathe. It gives us a rhythm, whether it's cadence or firing a weapon. Human beings, by and large, will not fire at another human being, but they interrupt that through breath technique, through breathing techniques, ancient breathing techniques, to not just make us fire more accurately, but to help us ignore the fact that we're about to take another person's life, which generally speaking, most of us won't do. So we interrupt the breath. So what we've had to do is try to find all of the things that are being highlighted by this virtual environment and interrupt those. So making contact with our own body. We begin what Mama Nia did at the beginning is the beginning and the end of every class. But now we have to not only make contact with our own body, which the environment we're working with, by and large, have at least some level of self-loathing. So body dysmorphia. So how do we make contact with the body? So it's literally reaching out, imagining. We also work with amputees. So saying, put your feet on the floor if they're paralyzed or missing a limb. How do we change that language? How do we include everyone? How do we trick the mind to remembering that the body's there? How do we give the body the opportunity to take over for the mind? So those have been the techniques that we've had to do, which is even reaching, for each other. That mere act of reaching can cause hormonal releases in the bloodstream that are that type, or making contact with ourselves, hugging ourselves. So a lot of these yes.
Sound.
Oh, well, the origin of, when I was talking about what trauma robs us of, obviously it's language. And even if we have the language to articulate, when we're in a traumatic environment, those parts of the Broca's area and other parts of the brain will actually go offline. So let's say we keep those online. Then how do we actually make language? And who has the language for us? And if we came from a childhood environment that robs us of our voice, we don't have it. So what Dawn's talking about is sound. And it doesn't matter if it's internal or external, and we do both. It can be external, our earliest, if we were lucky enough to be either consoled as a baby or even burped. The mere act of this is reminiscent. The body remembers this. The mere act of breathing and tapping ourselves can bring us back into our body. An alternate version would be just humming and sending sound into our body. That's from the inside out or the outside in. I don't want to take up too much time with it, but these are the things, the very basic tenets that are robbed from us. Our mantra is to reclaim our toddler selves pre-trauma. So that gives you an idea of what we're trying to bring back into the body and how challenging the virtual world is. But as was mentioned, also is giving us gifts. It's forced us to dial in. It's forced us to use imagination and creativity in new ways that we hadn't when we were in the room. That the physical touch with someone else in the room, we can cheat. So I will. Yeah.
And I'm just going to add one last thing, which is just a language thing around safe space. Our population taught us day one, we went into the workshop, we're like, this is a safe space. And they're like, yeah, no place is safe if you've been shot at and had IEDs explode out of Dorito bags. It doesn't exist. And then
or in your home street.
Or in your home street in this time. Yeah, exactly. So we changed the language to secure the space. And securing the space is the job of all of us in the circle. We all have that. So that John and Stephan didn't create a safe space. We, the circle, the people who showed up today, secure the space by having each other's back, by allowing each other to express themselves no matter what it is they're expressing without judgment, and we set up the tenets to, these are the things by not telling the stories of anything that happens in the circle outside the room. There's all these things and so then they feel a responsibility to secure the space to have each other's backs. And that seems to be a much better concept for them.
Well, I first want to thank you all for such an amazing conversation. This was so great, and I feel so necessary. And I hope that those that will watch this will take something away from this. And lastly, I want to pose a question to those that will be watching this. And so when you're offering, your self-care practices to the participants of your program, the communities that you work with, how much of that is rooted in your values and your privilege that you have embodied? And I say that because I'm going back to someone like me who uses walking outside to kind of de-stress myself, and then feeling stressed while I'm going outside because I know that I am not walking through the safest of streets. And so I will end this by saying, please join us for our live Q&A on that information is on the Facebook page. The panelists will be coming back and be able to answer any questions that you have around radical self-care. So please come prepared with questions, and I believe more information will be in the description below. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you.